Hello, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, August 31st. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers and we don't do buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But let me remind people that you can listen to our show live streaming on our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. We stream video of the show on our Facebook Live group pages, or our Facebook pages via Facebook Live. My wife shares it to a bunch of other pages, so we're easy to find on Facebook. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, which puts it up as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, so you can subscribe to our podcast. We take the video and we put it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. There you'll find not only this show, but the shows that I do in New York, and short-form videos that cover a range of topics. And in fact, some of what we're going to talk about today is the subject of videos that I've done in the past and a new one that we're going to get out there shortly. So that's the way you can enjoy the show live or after the fact. I am John Kane. I am the show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our video and our sound. All right, let's get into it here. It's back to school time. I know some schools. I've got a grandson and granddaughter who live in Pennsylvania. They already went back to school, but coming off of this Labor Day weekend, all the rest of the kids will be going back to school. And I just have to remind people that now some of that task turns to us. We've got to make sure what our kids are being taught in school is accurate. And look, I understand we can get into a whole debate on, their truth, our truth, whatever. It's still on us to tell our story, to tell our version of history, and not let somebody else create our history for us. And their history crosses with our history. So, I mean, when you consider the holidays that they celebrate and the kids get off from school, and look, that's how kids measure their school year, by when the next holiday is. Then the first holiday is Columbus Day. And I know many places are calling it Indigenous Peoples Day. But whether we call it Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day, the fact of the matter is that there's a lesson, there's a teachable moment there. And that teachable moment gives us the opportunity to tell some truths that have not been taught, not for generations. People have been listening to all these BS stories about what a hero and what a brave, explorer Columbus was. He wasn't a brave explorer, he was a merchant. So right out of the gate, the first holiday that comes in October, a month into school, our little kids have been indoctrinated with this 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and our older kids have been fed more of this BS. So it's on us. I mean, it's on us as parents, as grandparents, as Native elders, but anybody who has taken the time to do some of this research. And it's not just about Columbus Day. It's not just about Veterans Day or for that matter Labor Day that's being celebrated this weekend. But there's Thanksgiving, there's the Christian holidays, there's all of these holidays that most of which romanticize war, military, U.S. military, and we never really explain our relationship with the U.S. military. Yeah, well, we'll sweep it all under the rug and say, oh yeah, we enlist at a higher rate, and we've got code talkers, and we got this stuff. Look, we've had massacres that the U.S. military perpetrated against our people. All kinds of atrocities. So we can start with Columbus, but we can bring it up. We can bring it up to a few years ago at Standing Rock. We can bring it up to what's happening with missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous men, Indigenous girls, Indigenous boys. We can talk about all of this stuff, especially as our kids are being taught a counter narrative in school. They're being taught what they consider the established history. But we have the opportunity. And and it's not just history and social studies. It's literature. It's when our kids take a class where they have to speak or write a term paper. Ed always cracked me up when he talked about doing his his term papers, and they would give him a list of two or three topics that he had to do his term paper on, Shakespeare or whatever, and he'd say, "No, I'm going to do mine on this." I mean, the idea of doing a term paper is just the idea that you can do research and that you can communicate your ideas. And we should push these issues, and of course it comes all right back to the end of the school year. I mean, we're still having fights over not just whether a kid can wear regalia, but whether they can just put an eagle feather in their cap. So we can't expect our kids to take on these battles if we're not educating them. Yeah, I know our kids are in public schools, but there's no excuse for us not to supplement what they're learning or being taught, or correct what they're being taught. And I think it's on us to do that. They're not going to do that. They're not going to take it upon themselves. I mean, I remember listening to some of the professors from UB who were involved in the Native American program. They said, years ago, when they decided the New York State Board of Regents was going to delve into making sure that they did more to teach Black history and teach about the Holocaust and to teach about various things, immigration or whatever else. When they talked about Black history, they brought in Black scholars. When they talked about the Holocaust and some of that history associated with, again with the genocide in Europe, they brought in Jewish scholars. They brought in people to talk about migrant workers, who were among those Latin Americans that were so exploited. But when it came to Native issues, they didn't go find a Native scholar. They still took it upon themselves to characterize that history and write it up. We rarely have input in telling our own story. At our homes, we do. At our homes, we have every opportunity to tell our own stories and to teach our kids our version of history, our truths. And so it's on us to do that. So as we go into next week and realizing that our kids are going to go into school, and I'm not saying we got to send them to school with a chip on their shoulder, but we should take the time to find out, what did you learn in school today? And if part of their lesson plan as a kindergarten is to learn how to recite the Star Spangled Banner, maybe it's time to get them to recite the Ohonto Guriwadekwa instead, or Gunonyok. I mean, we should make help our kids make different choices, or let our kids know that they have choices, that they don't have to swallow what is being spoon-fed to them in their schools. And it's not about being, being difficult or causing conflict. I mean, we can't talk about instilling pride in who we are if we're not going to give our kids something to be proud of. There is some tremendous history, and look, our history is taught different. Our history is taught in stories. It's not taught in recitations about a specific individual and a specific date and that kind of stuff. We can talk about our systems of governance. Again, the role that the fire, what we describe as fire plays in terms of fire representing not only our family, but representing our right to counsel, our right to assemble, and so all of that. So this idea that we can teach using some of these forces of nature and the elements of nature to reinforce our storytelling. I mean, the reason why most kids hate history, they hate being told they got to remember a specific person's name, a specific date. If you want to talk to them about an issue, you can teach that issue without trying to make somebody just pound into their brains to memorize dates. I mean, does it really matter whether something took place in 1941 or 1942? I mean, especially the farther you get away from those dates. I mean, so when you're teaching kids about the American Revolution, are you willing to teach kids? I mean, our kids are going to learn this every year. There's a certain age group, and oftentimes multiple age groups, are learning the same lies. Oh, yeah, the American Revolution was fought because of taxation without representation. You know what? Bullshit. It's simply not true. That's not why they fought. You had a bunch of white colonial aristocrats who wanted to make more money. And one of the ways they knew that their wealth was dependent on slavery, and it was dependent on taking more native lands. That's the reason the Revolutionary War was fought. Just like the reason the Civil War was fought was over slavery. Everybody wants to soft pedal it and massage these issues and tell a different story, but nobody wants to tell the truth. So it's on us to tell it. And if our kids give an answer like that on a test and it's marked wrong, you know what? That's our job to go into that school and raise hell. Say, no. Who taught you your history? And then that's the reason we got to call some of the stuff out. So yeah, it's back to school time. But that means we have to go back to school. We have to go back and school our kids and explain to them some of the truth. And look, it isn't just old history. I mean, we're in a constant state of, some sort of struggle or conflict with the state of New York, oftentimes the federal government as well. Not only over policies, but over our right to earn a living on our own territory. So I just went to a meeting today up in Niagara Falls, talking about Eric White's case, where the state is trying to fine him $600 a carton for having a truck seized that was hauling a native brand of tobacco from one native territory to another native territory. $600 a carton. I mean, that's absurd. But we're not teaching this stuff. I remember years ago when my son was in school, one of his classmates, Ross John Jr., he did a paper where he talked about when the thruway got shut down. He was only a little kid at the time when the thruway got shut down, and how all the traffic rerouted and how busy and bustling places like Gowanda and Silver Creek were. I mean, he didn't even know what the issue was over, but he saw the impact of the conflict that we're having. And not necessarily the negative impact, because frankly, local businesses did very well when the thruway got shut down. So when I talk about things like the thruway going to crap and Andrew Cuomo not wanting to fix it because he thinks he's going to strong arm us, our attitude is let it shut down. Let the traffic come our way. But you see, we're not teaching this stuff. Even if our kids are learning a business class, we aren't learning about the distinction between native commerce and non-native commerce. We won't even go back to the history books and teach the real language of the U.S. Constitution, where it says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce in and among several states, with foreign nations, and with Indians. With, not of. Not our commerce, but the commerce that their people come to our territories and engage in commerce with us. Instead, it gets twisted around like they have, and in fact, Supreme Courts have taken that commerce clause and says, "Oh, see, that's proof that the founding fathers of of this great nation intended for Congress to have plenary, which means absolute power over Native people." How the hell do you come up with that conclusion? And you guys are supposed to be the finest legal minds. You want to talk about legislating from the bench? That's not, you hear the Republicans, oh yeah, all the Democrats, they want to put judges on who want to legislate from the bench. There have been rulings, and there have been legal dicta that has come out of the Supreme Court that has no legal, ethical, or moral foundation. The idea of codifying into law the doctrine of Christian discovery. But when you hear people talk about this notion of the plenary powers doctrine, that Congress has plenary powers, one of the Supreme Court justices said, "No, I can't find it any place." Ironically, or perhaps ironically, it's the only black justice. And I'm not a big fan of Clarence Thomas, but Clarence Thomas says, "I don't see any place in the Constitution that suggests the founding fathers intended Congress to have absolute power over Native people, to regulate the metes and bounds of tribal sovereignty." He said, "I don't see it," and he cites the erroneous way that people have deduced, whether it's the treaty clause or whether it's the commerce clause. Honestly, we're mentioned 3 times in the Constitution. Again, this isn't being taught in school, so this is why we got to teach it. One of them was the treaty clause, which doesn't even exist anymore, because they apparently thought they had us beaten down enough that there was no need to have a law on the books that allowed the president to engage in informal treaty making with Native people. So they've eliminated the treaty clause. So there's 2 places left, right? The commerce clause and what they call the apportionment clause. The apportionment clause is where they determine how each state is going to be, how many congressmen, how many representatives to the House will come from each state. And they said, well, this is how you count. We're going to portion it as a proportion of population. 3/5 of all slaves, so they're going to count 3/5 of slaves, even though the slaves have no rights. Bizarre. And they talked about other indentured servants, and they said excluding Indians not taxed. And of course, none of us were taxed at that point. I mean, I'm not saying as a people we weren't taxed. I'm not saying Native people didn't pay some taxes, but we weren't taxed as a people. So we weren't even a part of the Constitution in the beginning. And what nobody will explain, and they certainly can't teach us in school because it doesn't exist, is at what point we became part of we the people. Because there's no place in history that occurs. So, again, it's on us. We are the ones who have to be responsible for teaching this stuff. Look, I know, different territories, including Seneca Nation, has an education department. But, the education department doesn't actually educate. It's a department that supports education. I mean, they provide some tutors, but you know what? Most of those tutors are white. We don't have Native educators who are educated themselves in our own history. This is one of the things Ed Schindler always talked about. We don't put our own experts, our own knowledgeable educators teaching about our ways, our culture, ceremonies, festivals, how we counsel, how we govern. We don't teach that. Oh, they do a couple of Iroquois studies courses in these schools, especially the local schools. But when they teach Iroquois studies, what they're teaching about is, well, this is the way it was, 200 years ago. Like, we can't talk about who we are now. Even when we have Native people involved in these studies, we teach as if we're going to tell the way it was, not the way it is. And so by doing so, we're saying that we're not those people anymore. I mean, we won't even tackle the tough issues. The tough issues like, how did the Seneca Nation, for instance, go adopt the Constitution in 1848? Why? What was wrong with the other system? How was it corrupted? Well, let's talk about it. How did the separation take place between Tonawanda and the rest of Seneca Nation? I mean, what happened? What took place during the removal period as far as the Haudenosaunee, Senecas in particular? There's some Senecas that went to Kansas. They call them the Seneca Cayugas because it was a group of Senecas and Cayugas. I don't know how many, but they don't teach that. In fact, that is a quote unquote federally recognized tribe. But there's no unity there. It's not like there's I mean, even politically between the politics of Tonawanda and the politics of Seneca Nation, the people are fine. I mean, so I've got very close friends out in Tonawanda. I mean, the people are all fine. But from a governing standpoint, there's animosity there. Who's legit, who's not legit, who's Haudenosaunee, who's not Haudenosaunee, who's following, proper governing rules and who's not. I mean, it's, but why do these conflicts exist? Because we're not educating. We're not educating ourselves, and we sure as hell aren't educating our kids. So it is back to school time. It is time for our kids to, again, have their minds shaped by the government. Because these are government-run schools. These are public schools. And in fact, there's no question that public schools their purpose was indoctrination. They're supposed to teach national pride. I mean, that's why they, the first thing they try to get a kid to do is pledge allegiance to the flag and sing the Star-Spangled Banner. There's no reason to sing that song every time we engage in some sort of sporting event. It doesn't make any sense. And yet we just kind of go along with it. In fact, we'll even get some of our great native singers to go belt out the song for them. So, again, we should have I don't want to take the words of Mark Charles, but we need to have a national dialogue. No, we need to talk about this stuff. And it doesn't matter. We don't have to wait until somebody provides a platform for us to have these conversations. We can have this. I have the conversation right here on the radio all the time. We can have it in our homes. We can have it, sitting around a fire. Whether we're just assembling, just socially. I mean, this is what we did historically, and we're not doing enough now. And we really need to. We need to have these kinds of conversations. And it's not just about sitting around so we can all see who can preach to the choir the best. We should delve into some of these difficult questions and what we should do about them. Look, we talk all the time about certain things, like how are we going to deal with climate change as a hurricane bearing down on the southeast Atlantic shore? How are we going to deal with climate change? How are we going to deal with economic crisis? I mean, look, none of us are invested in the stock market. So those stock market numbers mean nothing to us. But you know, when that thing does finally crash, they're going to take a whole lot down with it. All of a sudden, that ATM card, I don't care if you got it from the Seneca Nation Credit Union. I don't know if they even have those, but I assume they do. I don't care where your ATM card comes from. It's entirely possible that one day you're going to go to that ATM and you're not going to pull anything out of there. All of a sudden, you can't order on Amazon anymore. So what do we do? You know, we talked about some of the things that we need to do in our communities to localize our economies. But you know what? That's not going to get taught in school either. I mean, just basic survival skills. And when I say survival skills, I'm not talking about making a fire with sticks. Yeah, we should know how to do that too. But one of the most important survival skills is what Ed Schiller talks about: communication. You can't survive if you don't communicate. Look, for many, many years, in the wake of so many atrocities that were committed against Native people, we managed to isolate ourselves, or we were isolated. You know, isolation was imposed upon us. So we either run off to these remote territories and said, okay, that's your reservation now. Or we were defrauded out of so much territory, we were resigned to small portions of our original lands. But in the process, there were decades, if not, close to, a century or so, that we were pretty much isolated. We lived separate. And not, I'm not going to get into the separate but equal thing, but we just lived separate lives. And they pressed the issue of our kids going to their schools, and of course they had the residential schools, which meant that our kids were still separate, and they weren't being taught even in the same way that the non-Native kids were being taught, but they sure as hell weren't being taught the skills they needed to know as Native people. In fact, that was being stripped away. But there was always this isolation, and generations. I mean, you can still find many people that when you talk to us, when I was a kid, we never went into Gowanda. We never went into Dunkirk. We never went into Buffalo. I mean, there was a sense that, those places weren't for us. Now, we've got generations of men who got into ironworking, working on big steel jobs in the cities, in New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, obviously closer by, Buffalo. But even as our men went into these cities to work, they were isolated. They formed pockets. I mean, where I broadcast in New York is just off of Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. It's not far from the area they used to call Little Gunawaga or Little Cognawaga, because there was a community of Mohawks that stayed together. Again, even in a city the size of New York, in complete isolation from the rest of the other people socially. Now, that isolation, we could look at it a couple of different ways, but one of the things that it allowed us to do was to maintain a certain level of distinction. And that distinction, maintaining that distinction, is what that's what the big challenge is right now. I mean, even as, again, I mentioned going to this meeting over Eric White's case being fined. He's being fined like $1.3 million for 140 cases of cigarettes. I mean, that's the fine. I mean, that's being imposed upon him. And what is the basis of that fine? It isn't based on necessarily us being singled out and treated. It's funny. Racism can go a couple of different ways. When we're racism, we can say, "Oh yes, we're being discriminated against." Well, at some point, our position isn't that we're being treated different than white people. It's that, and complaining about it. The fact is that we're not white people. We do maintain distinction. The state laws shouldn't apply to us as we're staying within our own pockets of population, native to native trade, conducting commerce with native products. We're still fighting for that distinction. I granted, there are some people saying, don't treat me like I'm this, don't treat me like I'm that. I don't want to be treated as any other American. That's not what we're arguing. We're not asking to be treated like Americans. We want the basic understanding and acknowledgement that we aren't the same as you. We're not saying we're better, I'm not saying we're worse, but we do have some things that we've maintained that we've never given up. And again, we don't teach our kids this stuff in school. All right, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to go a little bit farther on this. I think this is an important issue, and maybe I'll even break down. Look, it's Labor Day weekend. Let me talk about the failure of labor. We'll do that when we come back. All right, this is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back in a few minutes. Thanks for coming back. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. And let me begin by the second half of the show by thanking our sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White in ERW Enterprises. I mentioned I went to a meeting involving Eric and his company being engaged in a over $1 million battle with the state. And this is just one individual who's facing this. And his support of this show is because I'm one of the places that we can have these conversations. And of course, I do have a couple of other sponsors, one in particular that kind of remains anonymous. But I've got three major ongoing sponsors and a few people who make a contribution from time to time. And I appreciate those too. I also appreciate all those folks who have helped us in the past. We are in our 10th year now. This is our 10th year of Let's Talk Native. And we wouldn't be here if we didn't have many of the businesses. Some, I even saw a few of them today. But many of the businesses in Cattaraugus, Allegheny, Tonawanda, not so much in Tuscarora, but a little bit, that have supported my program, especially when I was on commercial radio. We wouldn't be into our 10th year today if I didn't have a number of people who supported us, at least in the past. I wish some of you would come back so we could do some more. But I do appreciate the sponsors I get, and I do appreciate those of you who share the program. As I said, our shows do become a podcast, so you can share a podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast, and you can share that subscription. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Let's Talk Native TV, and you can share those videos. And of course, if you're on Facebook, since we stream the show on Facebook Live, that's the easiest place to share the show, even as we're doing it. And then after the fact, I mean, when I go back through and I check the views, and look, I am not a viral sensation by any means, and nor am I trying to be. I have a target audience that I'm looking for. I'm looking for Native people who want to learn, and for Native people who want to teach, because the first step in teaching is knowing what you're talking about. So if I can get 1,000 Native people to listen to a program, even if it's only a piece of it, then those are people who can carry on a message, even if they don't agree with me. Because that's the other thing that I can't stress enough. I realize that some of the things that I say may be, against conventional wisdom. Because frankly, conventional wisdom isn't that wise sometimes. So I take a position that you may not have heard before. And you don't have to agree with it. But just know that there's a logic to the position that I take, even if you don't agree with that logic. Because these are the reasons, and these are the ways that we can have these conversations. So again, I want to thank all of you, especially my wife, who shares the show on anywhere from 20 to 30 Facebook group pages, and it's one of the ways that we share this show on many of the other Native group pages, where people are engaged in different elements of the same battle that we're engaged with here. So we're not just sharing it to other Haudenosaunee or Six Nations peoples. We're sharing it, to Indigenous people all over the globe. So. All right. Again, the theme of the show is for us to pick up on our responsibility in terms of being teachers, even as our kids go back to school. And part of it, look, when I say we need to correct the historical record, sometimes we're going to have to tell our kids that there's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. The reason that book exists is because, look, I'm not saying the teachers intend to lie, but they're being fed what is the curriculum, what they're supposed to teach. And unfortunately, some of what they're supposed to teach are lies. So we have to correct it. And as long as we are smart in how we teach our kids the truth and the corrections that we're talking about here, then, in school, they're going to be graded on their ability to rationalize. And back in the day, if you defied convention, you could get a 0. Now, if you can make a compelling argument, even if your teacher doesn't agree with you, what they've got to be grading you on is your research, your thoughtfulness, your obviously your grammar, spelling, that kind of stuff. Got a clue. If you use a lot of Native words, they can't ever tell you spelled them wrong because they don't know. So just between you and me. But no, we have an obligation to make sure that our kids are not being indoctrinated, or at least limited, and encourage our kids to think critically when they're being spoon-fed some of this stuff. And it's the same thing I say to my listening audience here. Don't take what I say for fact or gospel, as they say. Question what I say. Do your own research. If I throw out some facts or figures or some historical truths that you think, well, that doesn't sound right, well, check it out. I've got a good friend of mine who, when she first started listening to the show, she'd get pissed every time she listened to my show. How dare I talk badly about Thomas Jefferson? That's her hero. And then she finds out that Thomas Jefferson not only was a slaveholder, but he was a pretty tyrannical slaveholder and had sex with his slaves. And when we talk about residential schools, when I say, oh, these things existed into the 1970s, she says, that's impossible. There's no way that residential schools could have survived The civil rights movement. Yeah, they could, and they did. Why? Because we weren't in that battle. Look, I'm not saying AIM didn't exist. I'm not saying that that we weren't, fighting our sovereignty fight, not our civil rights fight, but our sovereignty fight. But no, the civil rights, certainly wasn't about Native issues. So again, I think that's why it's important. Look, one of the ways that we need to teach, and I'm not just talking about teaching a Native perspective. Some of it is just about teaching critical thinking. So, and one of the ways to approach this thing is just look at the days that our kids are going to be off from school. Look at the national holidays that the United States celebrates, and let's take a little bit of time and teach some truths about that. One of the two of the holidays that don't get a lot of attention in school are the 4th of July, because the kids are out of school, and Labor Day, because most kids start school after Labor Day. So we don't even get a chance to teach some truths about that. The kids learn about the Revolutionary War. But breaking down even something like the Declaration of Independence, I've done a couple of shows on that, and you can look for some of those shows on our YouTube channel and that kind of thing. But I mean, it's some of the truths and some of the Native perspective. I mean, again, keep in mind that the words "merciless Indian savage" is the way that we were described in the Declaration of Independence. So that whole "all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Yeah, they weren't including the merciless Indian savages in that. So I mean, these are some of the truths that we need to teach. Now the other one again is Labor Day. Now, Labor Day is supposed to be a celebration, and that's what is supposed to be celebrated this weekend. It's supposed to be a celebration of all the accomplishments of the labor movement, not just the people who work. I mean, this isn't just about celebrating people who work, but celebrating the labor movement. And I got to tell you, while I think it warranted celebration at one time, the labor movement is a dismal failure right now. There's never been a time, well, at least in modern history, certainly since the advent of Labor Day and the labor movement, there's never been a time that there's been greater income inequality than right now. I mean, the haves and the have-nots. I mean, the gap between the richest and the poorest has never been bigger, and the growth of the number of people living in poverty and living farther and farther from that from those affluent incomes is growing. I mean, look, I know people can get up there and brag about the unemployment rate going down. Most of that stuff is BS. And it doesn't really matter if the unemployment, in fact, I guess it doesn't matter. If the unemployment level is at its lowest, historical lowest, and yet there's a bigger income gap, that's problematic. That means that the poverty isn't even associated with not working. But poverty is associated with working. Look, we were taught, when I was in school, we were taught to, recognize the role that unions played in shaping the 40-hour work week, overtime pay, extreme overtime, time and a half, and double pay for so many hours over, of overtime. I mean, that's what we were taught. We were taught, were it not for the labor movement, there wouldn't be the 5-day work week. People would be working, not just 8-hour shifts, but they'd be working, 10-hour shifts 7 days a week. And not saying some places still don't do that, but the standard changed. There was a time when I was a kid growing up that just a man could work. His wife and the mother of the children could stay home, and a man could support a family of 3 kids, himself and a wife, maybe even a dog and a cat. That was, and they could do that with a 40-hour work week. That doesn't exist anymore. There's almost look, if you only work 40 hours a week and you're a single income family, you're living below the poverty line. And unless, look, there are some extreme situations where somebody who was working just a 40-hour work week, a wage earner, is perhaps making it. But I dare somebody to come up with somebody who is just working a 40-hour work week and supporting their family, I'm not saying to survive. I mean, to live well on a 40-hour work week. It just doesn't exist. Now you got mom and dad both working full-time jobs. And when I say working full-time jobs, oftentimes those full-time jobs don't just have them out of the house for 40 hours a week. It has them out of the house for 60 hours a week. And if they have to drive a distance in separate directions, because they have to have 2 cars now, you have 2 car payments, and mom and dad got to go in separate directions. So they may be spending 60, 70, maybe even 80 hours a week out of the home. And of course, now they got to pay for not only this income isn't just making their lives better, because now they got to also pay not only the 2 car payments, they got to pay for, both got to wear professional clothes. So they got to pay, have more of a clothing allowance. They've got to pay for childcare. And of course, they're living in their big mansion that they're barely living in, because both of them are out of the house. And if their kids are being tended to outside of the home, nobody's in the freaking house. I mean, on a given day, it's unbelievable how many houses are completely vacant. That was never the case in the past. I mean, houses were occupied. Now everybody's off to work, chasing the buck, living the dream. The labor movement has failed people. Why? Because, I mean, look, the other thing that we attribute to the labor movement is this idea of earning a vacation pay. 1 week a year. After so many years, it goes up to 2 weeks. Do you know most Americans don't take their vacations? No, they'd rather cash it out. They'd rather work through the vacation just for the money. Why? Because that's what they're obsessed with, is just earning a paycheck. And of course, United States is one of the few countries that doesn't have any paid, much in the way of paid maternity leave, no paid paternity leave. So, the automatic, letting men off the hook or denying men, depending on how you want to look at it, the opportunity to play a significant role in the earliest child development of their newborns is taken away, because they got to go out there chasing the paycheck. So, to me, if you're going to celebrate Labor Day, if you're going to acknowledge Labor Day, you need to acknowledge the shortcomings of what has become labor in the United States. Again, they want to brag about how low the unemployment rate is. Well, it doesn't matter how low the unemployment rate is. It doesn't matter if you've got people working and still living below the poverty line. And I'm not even going to get into the whole immigrant labor. I'm not just talking about migrant labor, but the idea that there are so many people that are working, that are undocumented workers, and it's like they're the villains here, like they're the enemy or something like that. They're providing jobs, they're getting underpaid, and providing a task, and oftentimes providing that task with a much greater skill than anybody who is a quote unquote citizen is willing to do. I mean, if you ever watch some of these the immigrant workers in the United States, and look, and this isn't ethnically, because every immigrant population that ever came to the United States, with the exception of the first ones, really worked their asses off. And many of them still do, until they work themselves into a position where all of a sudden they feel like that they are the privileged. It's amazing how many people could come from a country that would be and be oppressed as an immigrant, until they could, especially if they're European immigrants, they could somehow reach a point where they were no longer considered immigrants. Now they were considered, part of the white privileged. So, and that includes Jewish people, that includes Irish people, Italian people, all these, and those are 3 groups of predominantly Europeans that were absolutely persecuted until they could arrive as white people, until they could assert themselves as the privileged white. So, look, as you celebrate Labor Day, I think it's really, and look, I'm not going to get into election politics and all that other stuff, but this is something that we all need to play a greater role in, is supporting each other. And look, you're not going to fix the economic system or the labor system with your votes and prayers. This requires us to do some things. And again, I always emphasize how important it is that we have a stronger sense for community and family. There was a time that if you started a business, and again, I got to pardon the male dominance part of this thing, but you'd put on that sign, you'd put your last name, and then you'd say "and sons." Yeah, it was really skewed towards males. But the part that I'm trying to emphasize is that you built a family business. Now, when you go to business school, the way what you are taught is not to build a legacy business. In fact, they tell you don't become emotionally involved in your business. You need to manage the passion for what you're doing. I mean, people are told, don't treat your business like a child. Don't treat it like it's your family. You need to keep it, in such a way that you can dump it at any time. And so they teach business, in business school, they teach you how to create a business, a product, a service that has a global market acceptance. So the market is much broader. And that at some point, you can take that business public. So forget about owning the business and keeping it private in your family. No, do an initial public offering and sell some of it on the stock market. So you sell, maybe you offer 30% of your company up to a public offering. And then you use that money and you grow the business up, and then you sell another piece of it. The whole idea is to grow out a business and then dump it. Sell it out. And look, and it is called selling it out. I mean, and when people hear the expression "sell out," that's a negative thing. But look, this is what people are taught in business school: how to create a company based on a product or service that can have enough global appeal that you can grow the business out, sell pieces of it, 1, 2, get 2 or 3 bites of the apple, as they say, and then sell it out completely and retire on what you sold. Now the problem is that is the idea of creating business based on a global market, not on a local market. We no longer put a strong enough emphasis on local economies. In fact, when you go to business school, they don't teach you a whole lot about local economy. I mean, other than local economy being the starting place towards growing out a business that that can have global value. And I think we have to put a different emphasis on that. And again, some of this teaching starts at the school level, high school level, grade school level. One of the things I talked about when I talked about sustainable communities, I talked about the products and services we need to provide to each other. And I listed on that thing a babysitter's club, not just childcare, or and childcare in terms of pre-K and that kind of stuff. But I mean, even organizing young girls who aren't mothers yet, giving them some experience with children. I mean, it used to be the idea of, look, there's a whole book series for little young girls called Babysitter's Club. But and on the flip side, if we want to put it into gender roles, look, when I was a kid, the first job I had was mowing a lawn. And we've got plenty of people who need assistance doing their outdoor chores, and we could put our young men to doing those things. And so you teach not only the responsibility and the whole idea of being a community member and supporting a community, but you teach a certain responsibility with that. And I'm not saying, and look, I never encouraged my kids to go out and get quote unquote jobs while they're in high school. I said, no, while you're in high school, you're going to work the rest of your life and to support yourself. Right now, look, if you get a part-time job and this is just for spending money, that's fine. But don't get obsessed with it. Don't, at your age, become obsessed with making money. And don't let it take away from the things that you should be doing as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. You should be enjoying your youth, enjoying your high school experience. You should be playing sports. You should be doing theater. You should be doing all these activities with your classmates, with your peers. And the more I would see some of the local businesses, fill up with school kids. And of course, why would a business hire school kids? Why? So they don't have to pay them much of anything. So they can, pay them, at or below minimum wage. And again, this is where labor has been a failure, where the power of organizing labor. So gets back to Labor Day. But again, this is why it's so important that we understand that each of us has a role as a teacher within our community, even if we don't have kids, because even if we don't have kids, there are kids and there are other people that were around. When I talk about being a teacher, I'm not just talking about teaching kids. Part of the reason I do this show is to be thought-provoking, not just to teach. I'm not asking people to remember, word for word what I said, or to feel like I just spoon-fed them a bunch of BS that they've got to, take as truth, but to be thought-provoking and to have conversations. But I want to educate people. And more than me providing the education, me providing the conversation that encourages people to look at their own experiences. Because this is the thing I always say. Beliefs are what you are taught or what you are told. Knowledge is what you experience. So when I talk about some of the things that I do here on the show, and whether even as it relates to some of this stuff with teaching our kids, you have to go back to your own experiences. What were your experiences in school? When did you come to a realization that some of what you were taught in school wasn't true? When did you realize that there were lies your teacher told you, intentional or otherwise? Because we all get there. When I do events in New York City, whether it's showing a film or doing a speaking engagement or whatever else, I invariably get hit with the same response from some members of the audience. And, this is in New York City, and, it's a diverse group, and oftentimes they're very progressive. These are well-educated people with PhDs. Say, I can't believe that at my age, I'm 79 years old, I've got a PhD in this and that, and I got a master's degree in this and that, and I can't believe my education has betrayed me so. That's the response I get. And it's not because I'm smarter than them. It's just that I'm talking about stuff they never heard before. And they can't believe in their educational experience, in their pursuit of education, that some of the things that I'm talking about on my shows and at these events could be something they've never heard of. It's amazing how many people never knew what a residential school was. When I get into debates over things like the mascot issue, and I don't think enough of us do this, but I always go back to, I said, when your school adopted that mascot, when your school decided to call themselves Redskins in 1920 or 1950 or whenever it was, we still had children that were being ripped from their homes, being dragged sometimes thousands of miles away from their homes, and having the native beaten out of them in a policy called kill the Indian, save the man. And kill the Indian they did. They didn't just kill the notion of Indian. They children lost. These schools had graveyards. So when I have this conversation with white people, say, "Oh, how dare you take this away from me?" And they literally say that. "Oh, I've been a Redskin my whole life, since I started school." No, you haven't been. But that's what they're saying. And a bunch of outsiders want to come in and take it away from me. No, for one thing, what you're calling outsiders are the native people that you're referencing with your racial slur. And again, what you are trying to own is something that native kids were being deprived to the point of being beaten, physically abused, psychologically abused, even sexually abused. Even sterilization went along with these schools. Young women that were, especially what they call the full bloods. Well, like if they're light skinned, it means all right, they're already part of the way towards assimilation. That was the view they had. The young girls that they keyed in on were the ones that were where there was no white blood in them. Well, let's not let them reproduce. These are the kinds of things. So again, I experience this all the time. Whether I speak locally around here, even locally around here, even though there's a substantial Native population, several different Native communities around here, I still get the same response. I can't believe that my education betrayed me in such a way that I never heard of this. I mean, the first thing is a little bit of denial, as I said earlier. But then when you hear something and you say, well, what do you mean Abraham Lincoln signed the execution order for the largest execution in the history of the United States court system? What do you mean? Look it up. Mankato, Dakota 38. Look it up. So this is, again, that's why That's why it's important that we educate our kids. I mean, our kids shouldn't be indoctrinated to believe that George Washington was this hero. He was a guy who ordered the destruction of our communities. He wanted to instill terror in our people. That's George Washington. Jefferson, he was the one who began this notion of removing us from our territories. The Removal Act, everybody associated with Jackson. Oh, yeah, of course, that guy was a jerk. But this was Jefferson's brainchild. Lincoln, largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And we can go to Teddy Roosevelt, and we can go to, and on and on and on, all the way up through. And when we talk about things like, how is it the Senecas made such a bad deal in the Thruway, 50, 60 years ago? Well, you don't understand the circumstance that Native people, especially here, were living in. Not just the extreme poverty, but being constantly threatened with, we're going to eliminate you. We're going to terminate you as a tribe is what they were threatened. So you better cooperate with us or you'll cease to exist. And we bought into the idea that they actually had the power to do that. Because they did. They tried to do it with many people. And that's why we have a bunch of native peoples who are, quote unquote, not federally recognized. How did they exist if they were never acknowledged? This is what we need to teach. So back to school, folks. Back to school for our kids and back to school for us. We have to be the teachers. That's my program for tonight. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here on Tuesday. Yahweh.